what we're going to attempt to talk through today is players, essentially, whose redraft ADPs put them in a pocket of players that they might have more upside than, and they might belong in the pocket a round or two above, which is to say, because those are the types of players you should target in an auction, but that is also to say these are more or less the biggest targets that we have in all drafts formats, because they're also clear redraft targets as well.
Yeah, and so there are definitely some guys that I'm going to have as clear targets. Maybe the patient or aware of player targets early. We don't want you to overpay for some of the stars before the draft has started. We want you to come up with your valuations and be aware of whether or not those guys are actually values, as opposed to forcing yourself to land the first round pick sort of translated player because that's what you decided to do before the draft started. But Ben, the first question that I have to ask you is that we appear in a lot of formats to have this clear top 5, maybe it's a top 6, maybe it's a top 7. I'm looking at FFPC redraft ADP right now that actually has Austin Eckler sneaking in there ahead of Jamar Chase and Travis Kelsey, which I think is interesting, but perhaps not unjustified. Obviously, Eckler had a big season last year. We know there are some reasons why it's unsustainable big picture, but then also he has said personally he doesn't expect to have the same workload. But if we're looking at that big 5, if we're looking at Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, do you have a target or targets in that range where if they're as expensive as they usually are in an auction that you would still be going after them?
I mean, I think the big 5, especially, the first thing I would start, I typically look at tiers positionally. The first thing I would start to say is that, from an overall perspective, I think those guys are on a tier, in a tier of their own, and probably by quite a bit. We talked about this when we talked about, I can't remember what show it was recently, but we talked about getting the late first round draft slot and how difficult that can be. The running backs probably don't have anywhere near the firepower of Taylor and McCaffrey. Maybe they do, but it feels like a pretty steep drop off. The receivers, obviously there's overlap in ranges of outcomes, but the drop off feels steep. And the receivers similarly, from Kupp, Jefferson, and Chase down to, Diggs, Adams, and Lamb. And so that top 5, if it is an auction that's pretty flat from that top 5 down to the next best players, the Ecklers and the Harris and the Cooks, and there's not a huge gap, I think you'd want to be potentially getting into that top 5 if, you are in a format and in a room. I mean, typically I'm more likely to really pay up for a star in a shallower starting lineup league. Say it's a 1 QB, 2 running back, 2 receiver, 1 flex, kind of the old school way of playing fantasy football. Not a lot of depth to the starting lineup, maybe only 8 starting lineup spots or what have you. Then, yeah, whatever the not necessarily the cheapest of that group is, but whatever of that group you can get yourself into, if the next group behind them is going to be really similarly priced, it's probably not going to be reflective of the gap.
It wouldn't be if they're similar. I don't think that they will be this year because
Right.
there is such a big drop. But again, this question of Chase is interesting. And we do see him fall. I see him fall in a variety of formats in individual drafts, certainly not across the board. One of the things that you mentioned in the last show that I thought was good advice is I said to be active, to be in, make sure that you're in at that kind of 70% value of where you have the players. You're very active in the draft. People won't be able to tell necessarily where you're going, but if someone goes far below the actual value, you'll get that value. Whereas if you're sitting on the sidelines, you won't. You mentioned don't go above that and don't get caught price enforcing. That will destroy your entire draft. I think that the big 5 are an area where you can definitely price enforce, to your heart's desire. And if you get stuck, you'll be okay. Because
it's not really getting stuck with those players.
Right. I mean, you're going to be able to then do the stars. And I think that especially with Jamar Chase. You want to make sure that you are there. If he goes below, that's going to be a potential winning play for you. Now, we know that the reason that he sometimes will fall is that there are questions about the pass volume overall for the Cincinnati Bengals. There's a question for how this pie splits out when you have a T. Higgins and you have a Tyler Boyd also there. I do think that the concentration will focus on those players. And so I think that some of the things that you can, when you're just kind of spitballing it kind of in your head, you can forget the number of small, unimportant targets on some of the teams that get siphoned off, and then players who seem like they're going to have this really high target share don't necessarily have it. Whereas, a team like the Bengals for this season, especially, I think that we're going to see those guys be the ones who carry. But you have the potential for injury, and you have, Jamar Chase could end up being the greatest wide receiver that we've ever seen. He could certainly be a Calvin Johnson type of player.
Yeah. And I was going to say, Zach Taylor, coming from previously working with the Rams, has tended to follow that trend. The Rams have been very concentrated as well. So it's not, there's a lot of data that backs that up too. It's not just the strength of Chase and Higgins as a player, but systematically in Cincinnati, I think it makes a lot of sense to think that the targets will be fairly concentrated on, those two guys or those three guys. We've seen that on a lot of different teams. I mean, the team that always comes to mind for me is the Seahawks, where the third target almost never gets to like 70 targets. It's just, they're a lower volume pass offense, but it's just Ben Metcalf and Lockett since Metcalf came into the league. But yeah, the Rams have done that more with like a third or a fourth. Their typical 11 personnel is out there so frequently, and the Bengals were similar. So very high 11 personnel team. They're going to have Chase, Higgins, and Boyd out there. Probably Hayden Hurst is their tight end, but you'll see him have a couple plays. We saw Uzama have a couple plays last year, but you'll see a lot of it concentrated on the Chase and Higgins, and then what Boyd provides. And as you said, if an injury occurs, it could really consolidate on the other one. So I think that there's a lot of additional reason to think that. And I don't know, I guess I just wanted to say that because it's not just sort of the player talent, it's also the way the team operates. But yeah, I agree with you about that at the top. In terms of sort of next targets, though, I think I would be pretty out on the majority of the next running backs, a lot of the next receivers relative in auction, relative to this idea of potentially getting a higher quantity of the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh round type receivers. Because I do think that next receiver tier probably stretches all the way to AJ Brown in the third. And I wouldn't even mind not getting AJ Brown and going down and having my wide receiver one be, we'll just say DJ Moore to stick to my two favorite players, but somebody in that next group even. And sort of same with running back, although towards the back end of the non-dead zone backs, the maybe 2-3 turn type running backs, if you can get a good price there, I could see making those types of bids. Tight end is a position where I mentioned on the last show, really wanting to keep an eye on it. When I do my tiers later, I think I'm going to have Waller and Kittle, or I'll tell you right now, I'm going to have Waller and Kittle in a tier above everyone else, but a tier below the big three for sure. And I do think we've talked through recently, but I do think there's a little bit more concern there than we give the appropriate concern for in drafts, because they're kind of also the last options for truly, elite potential difference making tight ends. So they still make sense going where they go, and they're kind of that backstop. But in an auction, that tier break would be fairly significant to me, where I would be a little bit more aggressive in the Kelsey Pitts range, not as in on Andrews this year. What are your thoughts about the elite tight ends?
I agree completely. And I do have my rankings up. As you listen to the show, they probably will have been just updated. Have them up as tiers. You can look at them as a draft grid. One of the cool things that Dave Caban has kind of put together there, which I like just the visual of being able to see the players as opposed to look at them kind of in ranks is really cool. I mentioned that I thought the top 5 were a clear top 5, but in tight end premium, Travis Kelsey and Kyle Pitts are my number 6 and number 7 players. Obviously, the player there who stands out in terms of a guy who might be an auction value. He's another guy where if you follow my rankings, you're obviously going to end up with Kyle Pitts on a ton of your redraft teams. But in auction, perhaps you can get him without having to reach. And one of the things that was implied in the first episode this week, but I don't know that we articulated in exactly this way, is that auctions are fun because you can land your players without reaching. Now, my question for you would be, how much do you think that Pitts as what I would term a fun player, and then maybe those running backs that you sort of alluded to? One of the things that I would want to do in an auction as sort of a unique scenario, or at least one of the scenarios that I would game out, would be to have a team with Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, and J.K. Dobbins, and we've struck with 3 guys in the dead zone, but 3 young guys with what I would say are almost unlimited ceilings.
And questionable whether they're dead zone backs. I think Dobbins certainly is where he's going, but Breece Hall in a lot of formats is going late 3. I think I've always said that the 3rd round to me is a little bit of a transition round. And we talk about the types of backs that you're willing to target in the dead zone. So a Breece Hall being in that range to me, he would still be somebody to target if he was squarely in the middle of the dead zone from a profile perspective, right? But it's very similar to Jonathan Taylor's rookie year, where I was very, very in on him. It's a little higher on Taylor than I am on Hall right now, personally, but I wouldn't call him a dead zone back. I think having a rookie in the 3rd round, it's hard to certainly a player you're willing to take some stabs on. And then Etienne himself has risen up to sort of the early 3rd round, so hard to call him, but potentially dead zone, depending on where you create those definitions. Everyone has sort of a little bit slightly different opinions on that. I like that a lot. As an approach, maybe not getting all 3 or targeting those types of backs if they are coming in at a good price. When we talked about this idea, the first 2 players that popped into my head, we've talked a lot about the rookie wide receiver pocket. The first player that popped in my head was Garrett Wilson, who's now going comfortably behind Sky Moore, comfortably behind Treylon Burks. We've talked in recent shows and probably don't need to spend a ton of time on it about how, 10th overall pick basically being devalued for situational concerns when his teammate Elijah Moore, as a second-year wide receiver that we want to target as well, is not necessarily being discounted for situational concerns. Garrett Wilson immediately becomes one that I think will be in a tier for me that if the prices follow ADP to a degree, might be the rookie receiver that I would wind up with as well, because I don't think I would have him as far behind the other rookie receivers as he tends to go in redraft. And then another player I believe we talked about recently, but maybe not as much, Devonta Smith, in terms of the second-year receivers, is going quite a bit behind Elijah Moore, quite a bit behind Amon-Ra St. Brown, quite a bit behind Rashad Bateman, who's going even higher than those 2. And it doesn't make a ton of sense to me either. I'm, I guess, maybe more bullish on the Eagles' potential to throw more this year than the market is, because I am very high on A.J. Brown still as well. But Smith in particular, with the first-round draft capital and a very efficient rookie year in a low-volume offense, looks like a guy that should be in a group with these other second-year receivers like Bateman, St. Brown, and more that in redraft are going quite a bit higher. So those are the 2 pretty clear ones in these groups of players that we're going to be targeting anyway. And in an auction, you might get multiple second-year receivers. You might get multiple rookie receivers. But there is one in both of those groups that to me has stood out as the cheapest sort of easy target. You can maybe throw Kadarius Toney in there too, but I think there's a few more question marks in the sort of the long-term profile, obviously, with Toney. Smith is a guy that there's not even really a lot of question marks, so it's kind of confusing to me to understand why he goes so much further behind, the Amon-Ra and Elijah group, which is, like I said, still going behind Bateman.
And you kind of bring up an interesting, more global point of, in this auction, we talked about one of the things that you can do is load up on a lot of receivers from 4 to 9, unlike a snake draft where you only can have one selection in that range per round. In an auction, you could theoretically, and it's again going to depend on what the rest of the room is doing. If the rest of the room is approaching it similarly, then you might get forced into targeting wide receivers of a higher tier because the price gaps are just very minimal. But if the price gaps are there, we can target multiple guys in this range. Would you be looking to go for a lot of sort of quote unquote wide receiver 2 types of players? The theme that we've used from the very beginning, when we started a little bit over a year ago, was this idea that talent dictates workload and that you can really exploit that based on how drafters and fantasy managers are looking at week 1 and looking at player movement and all of that type of thing. If the wide receiver 2 is very talented and for whatever reason the community misses on how the volume actually plays out, that seems to me to be a very exploitable opportunity just overall, something that we're always doing, but especially in auctions.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea that not to think of even necessarily players as number 1 or number 2 wide receivers, right? I mean, certainly the number 2 wide receiver by ADP in some offenses, but a lot of teams just have 2 number 1s. We just talked about the Bengals, right? That's an example of a team, if they're concentrated enough, like T. Higgins, projected workload in that offense and with the efficiency in that offense and overall expectations are going to be better than the number 1 in a lot of other teams. So this idea that he's the number 2 doesn't really impact. You should look at T. Higgins on his own merits. You should look at every pick on their own merits is sort of that idea. And so, yeah, the number 2 receivers that are sort of co-number 1s, but the market treats them as a number 2. I think that's a great class of player to be considering. Sean, sort of thinking through positional rankings and tiers more, I'm just sort of jumping around and highlighting my biggest draft targets overall, but it's really easy to get back into the Trey Lance discussion, who I still think should be going essentially QB7 behind Jalen Hurts. Maybe you can make the case that Burrow and Wilson should still be going ahead of him. I don't believe that Tom Brady and Dak Prescott should be going ahead of him. There is obviously some Jimmy Garoppolo concern and some concern that Lance doesn't play 17 games, but when you're playing to win your league, you're playing for specific outcomes sometimes. And certainly Lance's, if he plays 17 games projection or outcome or situation, or however you want to talk about a range of possible scenarios, as long as he's on the field and for any game that he's playing, he's a top 7 quarterback. He should be a top 7 quarterback in DFS pricing. He should be viewed in rankings for those weeks as a top 7 quarterback because of the rushing profile and because of all of those things. So from a tier perspective, I will be ranking him that high. And I think he becomes another clear target.
He does become a target. I do wonder if in many ways auctions are sort of the last bastion of late round quarterback in 2022, where the potential to get several of these guys at $1 to free up the rest of your budget to really attack in a way that maybe you can't in Snake. Because one of the things that you and I talk about a lot is that you're going to draft your elite quarterback in that round or in that spot where you feel like the player value at other positions, at wide receiver and running back, really flattens out. If you're looking at, well, I can get this wide receiver in round 6 and then this quarterback in round 10, but vice versa actually gives me a more powerful overall lineup, then I'm going to go ahead and do that as opposed to draft a Darnell Mooney, a player I like, or an Amari Cooper in round 6. In auctions, you don't necessarily have that dynamic, or you don't have that dynamic. And while I love Trey Lance, I think that you should make a play for him. You should bid him up. He might fall into that sort of fun category where I think he could be a little bit more expensive in auctions. I also think that you maybe run into the problem in an auction where the Trey Lance fanatics are are more willing to go after him. What are the small values of a snake? If we want to talk about values, there is that because of the focus on ADP and getting ADP values and just sort of knowing where players are going to go, the Trey Lance enthusiast in your league is still kind of looking to hit him at ADP. You can play chicken with the other drafters a little bit. Once you're there and Trey Lance has been nominated, there's no playing chicken anymore. I mean, you either get him or you don't get him because you bid the highest. And I could see that being one of those dynamics we discussed where maybe you do have to let the player go in order to push that cost onto somebody else. And so, but if we're talking quarterbacks, I mean, it's never a bad time to throw out the fact that Jared Goff is going to have some awfully good weapons this year, that Mac Jones is going to have some awfully good weapons. And if we're looking to hit the end of the QB1 tier, you're talking about Darren Waller having some issues, but how does Darren Waller have issues? He's catching passes from Derek Carr.
Had to get the trifecta in. I was waiting for Derek Carr to be mentioned. Had to start with Jared Goff and Mac Jones. I love your thought about auctions. And you called it the last bastion for late round quarterback, but just this idea that you can go so low with your investment at certain positions. I talked on the last show about how that can apply to zero RB, where you can get a really powerful zero RB running back group, a lot of like maybe round 8 to round 10 type running backs at low cost that all total maybe the price of one first round running back. And it's your whole running back room. And you also aren't taking any running backs that were, round 12 or later type, more flyer types. You're still getting a lot of the premium zero RB types. But similarly, I have done what you just described at quarterback with running back in auctions where I essentially allocated no money to running back. And it is like sort of a true zero RB. Because again, as you talked about, there's not this like specific round opportunity cost, right? And so even if you do a late round quarterback structure and you take your quarterback in the 12th round, maybe take Derek Carr in the 12th round, that comes with an opportunity cost of other 12th round players. It's still one of the 12 players you've drafted to that point. That doesn't mean it's, if you're trying to apply values to snake drafts, it's not 1/12 of your overall value of that draft yet, but it is a bigger chunk than $1 of maybe a $200 budget. The ability to do $1 out of $200, 0.5% of your budget on, maybe you have to go to Jared Goff or Mac Jones, but on a quarterback that is very low value. And similarly, as I was saying, if you really wanted to go extreme zero RB to potentially, maybe not all $1, but maybe your highest price running back is like a good $6 value or $5 value, and several others are, 4, 3, and 2, and your whole running back room is $15 out of a $200 budget. You can be more extreme than you could ever be in a snake draft in terms of at least the value that you're getting out of it. So that is a really fun element of auctions, how you can allocate more extreme. And that can allow you to be super powerful at other positions and really put a lot of that value towards other positions when you sort of punt one. So, but it's a smart punt. It's it's a controlled punt, if you will, where there's still some upside and there are still outcomes that can certainly work in your favor. So I really like that as a broad concept. Where are some other, we talked, I think you're right with a lot of the names that I came out just firing off, that they're sort of trendy enough or interesting enough that they probably get pushed up more in an auction, especially Lance. Maybe Garrett Wilson gets tethered a little bit to where Sky Moore and Chris Olave go, even though he goes almost a full round later in early main event drafts over on FFPC. Maybe he gets tethered to their prices a little more in an auction. Maybe the same is true for Devonta Smith or some of these other players we were discussing. Maybe that gap between the top 5 and the next group is, realized in an auction. I think probably will be in most auctions this year, with the potential exception of Chase, as you said. Where are some pockets? Are there some pockets that you think, and you did already highlight Etienne, Hall, Dobbins, but some other ones maybe that you think the players aren't quite as trendy, but belong in a higher tier and could come in at a really nice value? What about Pat Freiermuth? What about these mid-round tight ends?
Freiermuth is tricky, and I have added him a few times recently. this is probably the right time to throw in that I've decided the heck with it on Trey McBride and trying to make sure that I have proper exposures and proper prices, and I'm just drafting him everywhere. You look at Pat Freiermuth as being our guy that we were on like that last season, and not to say that McBride is going to be the same player or to have the same red zone touchdown rate, but I do think it's time to start adding some rookie tight ends to the very back of your rosters, because I think we're going to see that kind of thing a little bit more. It's easy to think of Kyle Pitts and to know that nobody's going to be a Kyle Pitts, but some of these guys could be a Pat Freiermuth, and the offensive context for guys like McBride and Dulcich could actually be much better. Now, there could be more competition as well, but I think that you have to consider that. You mentioned tight ends sort of as a group, and I think that tight ends are fun overall this season because they're so deep. One of the problems I've run into in our RotoViz OTs, our overtime, for the overtime listeners, the listener leagues, is that the tight ends actually are drafted more efficiently in the listener leagues. And so Colin and I have been caught out at that position a couple of times. But you think about guys like a Noah Fant, like a Gerald Everett, like an Albert O, even say a Mike Gesicki, and Cole Kmet, someone you should definitely be on, especially I think if you're looking for someone to play opposite an Amon-Ra St. Brown in a tournament format. But because the depth there is so intriguing this season, I think it's very important to be aware of what you're spending, certainly on guys like Dalton Schultz, TJ Hawkinson, another player that we really like, but Dallas Goedert, Zach Ertz, Dawson Knox, even a Freiermuth who's tending to go above that group that we just talked about. I think that a lot of those players have more upside because of the offensive context. And in an auction, if you're in on a lot of them, then I think that you are going to hit one or two at prices that allow you to really spend at the other position.
Yeah, I really like that. And on your McBride point, maybe you're not in a deep enough league to draft McBride everywhere or what have you, but it's probably also a good time to just say that Zach Ertz's price makes 0 sense. He's being drafted as if Trey McBride wasn't drafted, and yet to the Cardinals, and yet Trey McBride was the first tight end off the board, isn't even being drafted right now, doesn't have an ADP in the top 20 rounds on FFPC. When I look at the grid format, we do have other rookie tight ends, Cade Otton and Greg Dulcich in there. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's a lot of scenarios, I think, especially with Hopkins being out early, that McBride is getting a little extra run, and a lot of scenarios that by the end of the year, you said to me before the show, you think McBride might just outscore Ertz straight up. So Zach Ertz is going tight end 9 right now in a premium spot, especially in these tight end premium drafts. He's going in the 7th round. He's going ahead of, every rookie receiver. He's going ahead of Devonta Smith. Don't understand his price whatsoever. So that's the other side of that coin.
And Ben, tight end is a position too, where if you want to employ the stars and scrubs approach that we discussed at the end of the previous show, I think that you can work a couple of those guys in. It's definitely something in an auction where I think you can take even a little bit more advantage of the fact that there's a massive dead zone for tight ends. You noted the concerns that we have about Waller and Kittle, and maybe even throw Kittle into that group. But you pull up the positional heat map tool through the Best Ball Win Rate Explorer at RotoViz. This would be sort of best ball specific, but you're going to see a similar dynamic in terms of the scoring of tight ends and how it impacts what you do in various types of redraft leagues as well, where you don't want to be in on those guys who are compromise types of picks. You really have to wait multiple tiers down if you miss on the top players. And tight end is play a superstar or play a potential breakout name. We've had some of these guys break out in the last 4 or 5 years. Those players have been fun. Tight end is actually not deep. It never ends up being deep, but within the context of it not being deep, 2022 is a fantastic year for potential breakouts. At least the potential is there in a way where most years, I think you have to be more lucky this year you're being given a lot of really good shots.
Yep, I agree with that. And shout out to my former host at the CBS podcast when I was spending time with CBS, Adam Azer, who, when I was talking about basically exactly what you said, came to mind. He liked to say that I wanted my tight ends to be great or late, and that's sort of the strategy that I completely agree with that you just outlined. That dead zone is those compromise picks, those next tight ends. You didn't get the great tight end, but you're still thinking you need to get an early tight end, and yet they're not great, and you're just paying a really high price for Zach Ertz. Maybe let's talk about running back, because in all likelihood, and you've talked about some scenarios where maybe you'd consider paying a premium for running backs. I'm sure you would be willing, with your stars and scrubs approach, to be willing to consider Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey at the right prices. You talked about Etienne, Hall, Dobbins, but almost regardless of even if you get one or two of those, the pocket of premium 0 RB targets will be in play in auction. The group that comes right after sort of the dead zone backs are off the board, the lead backs, the guys that projections are still going to push up in auction value. You know, Miles Sanders, Elijah Mitchell, Antonio Gibson, Josh Jacobs, maybe even Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Some of those guys might be good this year. I'm not trying to necessarily, target all of them very specifically, but it's guys that feel like dead zone backs, right? But after that group, you start to get into the premium, 0 RB candidates. You get Tony Pollard, Devin Singletary, Kareem Hunt, Kenneth Walker, Rashad Penny, Chase Edmonds, James Cook, getting to Cordero Patterson potentially as a guy who get fairly cheap. And if he has the same role as last year, is probably going to be a pretty good value. I've not been taking a lot of Cordero Patterson, but been considering if I'm making a pretty big mistake that I'm not just taking what drafters are giving me. And on. You get into Rachaad White, you get into the New England backs, Damian Harris, Romandre Stevenson, even through, Alexander Madison, Ronald Jones. Eventually this tier runs out. I like Isaiah Spiller, like Darrell Henderson, like Michael Carter, Kenneth Gainwell. But eventually you get down to about Khalil Herbert, and you're starting to run out in this tier. You're getting into, James Robinson, who there's real concern if he, what he will be health-wise. You're getting into Daryl Williams, who I used to make a case for taking him when he was on Kansas City. Sean, you'd always kind of tell me that I was crazy for wanting to draft that guy, but you had some really nice compliments for the fact that he's been able, as a non-NFL athlete, to carve out a strong career a couple of weeks ago, which from a real human perspective, in a way only you can, from a real human perspective, we're kind of sweet, but we're also sort of thinly veiled ways of saying you shouldn't be drafting Daryl Williams. You get into that group, RB 50 and on, there's maybe a few pass catching backs. There's still some 0 RB swings. You can go get, Benjamin or, Jerick McKinnon or some of those guys. But that group from Tony Pollard at RB 28 until about RB 45, RB 50, that is a group that I spend a lot of time, or I would say that there's not a pocket of player that I take more of in auctions.
Well, first we have to start by saying that you were right too about Williams for last year. He did a very nice job and scored fantasy points in some key moments. He was a good player to have on rosters. You look at this year's situation, and I guess I go back to this theme of, in auctions, I'm kind of looking to do the things that I can't quite pull off in Snake. And so when I play half PPR, I'm trying to build teams and maybe hyper fragile teams that I don't think will work in full PPR. In auction, I'm trying to target a few of these guys where the opportunity cost is still not quite right. We talked about quarterbacks a little bit earlier in this show and how you can do some different things. One of the issues for 0 RB drafters is just, how do you work through the fact that in that key area where you're wanting to draft these running backs, sometimes it can cost you. Sometimes it can cost you that breakout tight end. Sometimes it can cost you sort of that last really star QB. Sometimes it can cost you your rookie wide receiver that you're thinking is undervalued by 2 or 3 rounds. And that might even push you to go an anchor running back approach, because that's actually the receiver that you have targeted. But in an auction, you can at least explore those prices and see if they'll be a little bit different. I just put out an article this week talking about how fantastic Tony Pollard's peripherals were, and really actually changed my own mind, just kind of working through it and looking at what he's done. The contract probably will be less of a hurdle, and that's Elliott's contract that we were talking about, will be less of a hurdle this year if things break in the right way. I've come around just in the last really 48 hours to believing that he has more Austin Eckler-ish type of potential than I was previously considering. And so when you're looking at, around 7-8 price in Snake, that's still problematic for somebody who they've been reluctant to play even when Elliott was struggling. But in an auction, maybe you can hit on it. Maybe that price will open up for you a little bit. Romandre Stevenson is a back who was an absolute star as a rookie, and yet he's in this complicated Patriots backfield where you have Damian Harris, you have all of the different potential pass-catching running backs. I'm a big fan of Pierre Strong. I don't think it's impossible that he ends up flashing to the extent that they have to play him a little bit. And so you look at his price, and there are some guys after him where just, even though we talk about workload not being the thing that drives our zero RB choices, talent is, we still differentiate when we're trying to price out various potential scenarios. We differentiate between backfields that are 2 or backfields that are like 4 or 5, because you require a very different scenario in a 4 or 5 player backfield than you do in a 2-player backfield, and you have to price it differently. But in an auction, again, maybe you can get Stevenson. He's definitely someone that you're at least in there with on the bidding. Michael Carter, Isaiah Spiller, and then maybe Rachaad White, the other player where I think, because sometimes when you lose to a guy that you don't really want to lose to, and in this case it would be Leonard Fournette, you're thinking, that guy will probably get me again. Leonard Fournette will probably stay healthy and take all the touches. And you're looking at the standalone value and thinking, does White have the standalone value that an Isaiah Spiller or a Kenneth Gainwell or a Tyler Algier have in that same area? But in an auction, maybe, again, I hit a price. So I'd be looking at some of these guys that I think the talent level is just so appealing, and maybe the opportunity cost in an auction is tweaked just enough that you can land some of those guys, maybe at least one of those guys, to complement the very clear-cut zero RB choices that I think we have in that area.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I don't have a ton to add there. What about wide receiver? I mean, I think the other thing that we should drive when we talk about player-specific stuff is where we think sort of the wide receiver tier break is. Because we always talk about how wide receiver's not that deep. Last year, at this time, we were saying on almost every show, after Deebo Samuel, it falls off. It felt like Deebo was kind of the guy. He ended up rising a little bit in August, but we wound up with a lot of Deebo as a result, just sort of as the last guy that was being sort of undervalued to his upside, and we got lucky enough to see that upside. There's always a little bit of a transition. I know last year after Deebo, you had some like Tyler Boyd names and some people that were also still interesting, but maybe didn't have the same type of appeal. So the like really premium upside, to me, the end of that is right around those rookie receivers, or that's sort of the transition, and that's what makes them so appealing to add to any wide receiver build in the Snake, in an auction, whatever. You can get them relatively cheaply, and they do still add, if not full season, which they could have full season, ceilings, at least that late season ceiling that we know rookies have, and the market is just not valuing this year. As far as, true, non-rookies, I guess, the veterans, I mean, when you start to, this year, it's a little thinner. You start to get into like Hunter Renfrow, Christian Kirk, Allen Lazard pretty early in drafts. You get to DeAndre Hopkins, who's suspended, but maybe makes some sense for some builds if he comes back and is very good after those 6 weeks off. Michael Thomas, who knows with his health? I mean, we started to get more positive reports about that. Russell Gage goes before that. You're starting to really run thin. And I find myself targeting a lot of the, second-year receivers in snake drafts in that range, these more upside profiles. after the rookies, I mean, I'm still interested in like a Rondale Moore. I'm still interested in Tyler Boyd again this year. I think Kenny Golladay is vaguely, at his price, interesting with the way that the Giants could wind up throwing just an absolute ton if they're throwing with intent like Brian Dable did with the Bills, and they're also trailing late and then throwing in negative scripts. You need Golladay to play at the level he did prior to 2021, but there's some reason to believe that his price is something that he could beat and makes him worth considering. Is there a specific sort of drop off or cutoff that you see at wide receiver in that, let's say round 7 all the way through, round 12 range?
Yeah, I think it fits very much with what you said. I have Tyler Boyd ranked as wide receiver 45, Rondale Moore ranked as wide receiver 46, Moore approximately wide receiver 53 in ADP, depending on what you're looking at. And I think that listeners probably can guess which of the 7 or so wide receivers I would exempt from that group of targets. They'd be names like some of the ones that you just mentioned, Ben. And kind of relating that back then to the scenarios that we talked about gaming out, if you're putting together a hardcore 0 RB team in an auction, which is sort of the question from a listener that started all of this, I think that you want to probably have 8 guys from that top 45, top 46 group. If you're taking a slightly more stars and scrubs approach and you feel very comfortable putting a lot of names like Hamler and Chenault and Fuller and Julio in at the bottom, then maybe you don't need quite as many. Maybe you can focus on even more of the 0 RB backs as well. And it also depends a little bit on if you're able to hit a Jamar Chase as the 1 and then have 6 or 7 guys behind him. But the beauty of an auction is that you can get those 8 wide receivers from that group. And depending on how, which scenario you're playing, both in terms of your own approach and in terms of what your actual auction gave you, that's where I would be looking to target. And Ben, with our 8 in the top 45, I think we do have to wrap back around to kind of the very beginning and look at how we might want to play the expensive players in this group, especially if you end up in a room with 11 players who maybe are more similar to yourself. And if you actually don't get a lot better prices, and you can tell early that you're not going to get a lot better prices on the guys in rounds 4 through 8, are there any names in rounds 2 and 3 that you'd be going after? I know that you've done a lot of projections recently. You've been doing some really cool projection shows with Michael Leone. When we look at those early couple of rounds, we have names like Tyreek Hill as a veteran option, Mike Evans as a veteran option, both of the Chargers wide receivers as veteran options. And those guys are interesting to me because one of the things that we saw last year is the potential for a specific quarterback, either one who is an upgrade or one who's a good fit with a player. I think with Matthew Stafford, obviously you'd have to say both of those things apply to what he did for Cooper Kupp, because obviously it just wasn't across the board, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm a little bit, I'm not drafting him, but I'm also not saying that listeners shouldn't draft Allen Robinson, because perhaps that does play out. You mentioned how they're concentrated, but it wasn't like Robert Woods took a massive leap or Tyler Higbee took a massive leap. With the Chargers guys last year, we got to see where Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were playing with Justin Herbert. Now it's possible he takes even another step forward. I mean, he could end up being a player, on the same type of level as a Patrick Mahomes. But guys who are maybe a little bit more locked in to volume, more locked in terms of what we know about how they're going to perform from a targets per route run perspective. Those types of guys in rounds 2 through 4, you have someone like a Deontay Johnson, you have a Terry McLaurin. Again, not that the 2020 season couldn't be different. You can have quarterback injuries with McLaurin. I mean, there's maybe a chance that Carson Wentz is his guy. I mean, that seems hard to believe, but it's at least something that you have to consider. Are there veteran receivers or other receivers in what we expect to be the higher priced range that you think could still be someone who, if an auction falls the right way, you would be in on?
Yeah, I mean, starting with the Chargers receivers, we did see, you mentioned sort of kind of knowing what they are. We did see Mike Williams take a little bit of a step forward on his full season targets per out run numbers last year after sort of languishing in the same like 17, 18% of routes he was targeted on for several years. He jumped up to 21%. With his more like downfield profile than Keenan Allen, with Keenan Allen's targets per out run falling a little bit, sort of in conjunction. I do like Williams more at price, especially because he's going a little bit later, but probably straight up than Allen. But I like both those guys because I do like what you just described in terms of targeting Herbert and that offense. But I would say in front of where Allen goes, A.J. Brown right now with the ADP I'm looking at is wide receiver 11, Keenan Allen wide receiver 12, Michael Pittman wide receiver 13. I think the tier break is after A.J. Brown. I think Brown is in a group that includes T. Higgins just before him and Tyreek Hill and Debo and Mike Evans and CeeDee Lamb all the way up to the late second round. The way I would approach that group is essentially looking for good prices. Now, Mike Evans is the one that I'm least comfortable with because the way that I've started to think through the Chris Godwin thing is he's being priced in a range where there's probably not enough concern being put on how much time he might miss. At the same time, Mike Evans and Russell Gage are being priced in a range where there's definitely not enough concern being put on scenarios where Godwin comes back after 3 or 4 games. Because if he does, Mike Evans, middle of the second round, as this guy who's going to be the new target hog because Chris Godwin's not playing, which seems to be the line of thinking for him, for Evans at this stage of his career to be going as high as he's going. That might not play out as much if Godwin does get back by, early October or mid-October. And certainly Russell Gage. I mean, I've thought that Tampa Bay, the market is sort of playing both sides of that incorrectly, I think, in my mind. I'm probably more willing to take Godwin at price. I've seen a lot of smart people say that Godwin's injury means that he's overvalued. I'm probably more willing to take him at price than I am Evans or Gage because, I think the scenarios where Godwin comes back reasonably early would really torpedo the value or the position that Evans and Gage are being drafted in right now. So Evans would be the one in that group that I'm not as high on. But I think between Lamb, Debo, Tyreek, Higgins, A.J. Brown, that whole group, you could even stretch it maybe to Diggs and Adams if their prices are sort of tied in with this group in an auction. I'm looking at who can I get the best price on, sort of, right? And so it's trying to manage that as a tier. Brown being, a guy that I love and going the latest, the clearest target and somebody that I see as a bigger upside, scenario or having a bigger upside scenario than maybe the market seems to believe with how good he's been. We've talked a lot about him, obviously, so we don't need to spend a ton of time on him, but somebody who has never run more than 406 routes in a season, you get him up to 550 or 600 routes. That alone is going to create a different type of upside than we've seen.
What about Cortland Sutton and Terry McLaurin?
Yeah, I was just going to go into that next group. So McLaurin's one that I'm not as excited about. Sutton is one that I would say that I am. Don't really have strong analytical reason. I think listeners all offseason know that I've been high on what Russell Wilson can do for the Broncos. I think he fits really well with Sutton. I think Deontay's a really interesting bet in that range. A lot of smart people are in on Marquis Brown. I'm in, but I don't think I'm as high as a lot of smart people, and that might include you. So I'd be interested in your thoughts there. We know I'm in on DJ Moore, and Jalen Waddle's a guy I still want at his price relative to Tyreek Hill's price. It's another one where I like the cheaper guy that's maybe more ascending than the veteran. But yeah, that kind of gets you through the 4th round. That next group, again, would be looking at for good values, but also some of those guys would be the ones I'd be more willing to target. Mclaurin is not one. What are your thoughts on Sutton? I mean, sorry, I was going to ask you about Marquis Brown or Sutton.
Well, that group there, those 3 players are going to be pretty heavily reliant on actually executing the air yards. We know that all 3 of them are downfield targets. We know that they're among the players where, because of that vertical element, if they hit, then the upside is significant. And so when you look at the quarterback shift, and I have to say that I think that it's, we always react to what happened the previous season. And even if it's a thesis that makes sense and is important, I think that sometimes, especially when the thesis makes sense and is important, it's easy to then emphasize it a little bit too much. And we saw the value of the quarterback shift. And we know that the ability of the quarterback is going to play a large role in the efficiency of the receiver. So you see what happens with Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford. And then every receiver who gets a bump in QB play and or sort of a lateral move and into a better offensive context, then those players are going to be so coveted in the year after what we just witnessed. So Marquis Brown moving from the Ravens to the Cardinals, having Kyler Murray and being in an offense that is still going to be very aggressive through the air, score a lot of points. You want to have that exposure when you know that Marquis Brown was a couple of long drop touchdowns from being someone who would be even more expensive than he is. You look at Cortland Sutton and just the catastrophic error conversion rate last season, and you're thinking, well, what is the thing that Russell Wilson does well? Russell Wilson has a lot of limitations as a QB, but he's someone who, and this is one of the things that's so cool about football and so cool about so many different sports. I mean, the sport that I probably know the most about is tennis, and there are so many different ways in which maximizing your strengths and mitigating your weaknesses and then tactically allowing those things to, either beat the opponent or not. It's just, there are endless permutations to how all of it can work. Russell Wilson has become a superstar, or is a superstar, has been a long-term superstar with the Seahawks, despite even the extra things that the coaching staff throws in his way, because he has the ability to extend plays and throw accurately down the field. Big plays in the NFL, as we saw last year, as all the defenses adjusted and tried to make Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes run these 15, 16, 17 play drives. And the Patriots have been, for almost 20 years now, have been trying to make offenses execute as many plays in their drives as possible in order to get down there and actually score. When you have a quarterback like Russell Wilson who can take all of that in one chunk and is so good at it because of the deep accuracy, and then you have threats like a Cortland Sutton and, ideally a Jerry Judy, but specifically then a rehabbing and potentially just unbelievably electric KJ Hamler, you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, this is the perfect fit. And so Cortland Sutton is the guy that he was in some ways before the ACL tear, if he is the guy that he was last year in terms of how the team deployed him or what his vertical profile is, and then you put him with Russell Wilson, I mean, you're thinking that the prices that you get in any format, in an auction, in a snake draft, I mean, they're not Cooper Kupp prices. So, where can he get to? And then the flip side of that is with Terry McLaurin, you're just like, what's the realistic chance here? And I think especially when, Terry McLaurin's prices make no sense to me because he hasn't been able to execute the profile that he's had, which is a pretty good profile. But now that profile, not only is it problematic that his quarterback upgrade may or may not be an upgrade. Now, Michael Pittman had a solid year last year with Carson Wentz. So maybe there's more upside there than I'm thinking. But because Jahan Dotson was overdrafted, I think it's easy to kind of ignore the fact that he was one of the best performers in offseason activities this year. And you've got to take that into play a little bit. So maybe he should have been like the 40th pick instead of where he went. But if the 40th pick has a fantastic offseason, then that's a problem for the wide receiver one who in many ways is relying on volume. Maybe it's not this crazy target volume, but the overall volume there. You lose some of those deep passes, that's going to hurt. They also potentially have Curtis Samuel coming back. there are a lot of things in that context for McLaurin that I don't think that you can draft him in the range that he's going. And that's despite the fact that I think he's a good player. And so when we talk about talent, but there are a few other things that we have to consider as well.
That was an all-time segment. I hope, Colm, you're going to need to clip that and get that ready for Twitter. So I implore our listeners to go and rewind and just listen to that whole thing again. So many players caught strays there. Like John Dotson, just like sitting over here doing nothing on his own, just like
he's
strays.
been fantastic. I've started drafting him all over him now.
I mean, you were complimenting Russ in or I don't know, maybe that can't be called a compliment. I don't even know what your opinion is on Russ after that section. That was I was laughing all throughout that. That was a very, very fun segment. Yeah, Trey Mclaurin should probably be a 10th round pick. I agree with basically everything you said, for the record. I think Trey Mclaurin should be like a 10th round pick now after you said this, though. Yeah, Carson Wentz obviously is not Russell Wilson. You talked about, if you say Russell Wilson has limitations, I don't know what you would say about Carson Wentz if you really went into what he is, but that was a fantastic, and then just heaping praise for KJ Hamler in the middle of it. It was perfect. 10 out of 10, no notes. Loved it. Loved every minute of that. The next group, Sean, Allen Robinson, Brandon Cooks, not really guys we're on. What about Gabe Davis? We talked about DK Metcalf. If you can get those guys at interesting, I guess I don't really know where you're at on Gabe Davis. I'm getting in on him. If you can get those guys at good prices in auction, are you interested? I mean, I think we're probably very comfortable with DK Metcalf at a good price, or I'm guessing that's your answer there. But what about Gabe?
Yeah, this one is tricky because it's just really unfortunate to have that week 17 game with the Bengals. And as a result of that, and as a result of both the stacking and the correlation plays, to have his ADP pushed up into a range that probably isn't justified based on what he has done. And yet my take, and maybe it's not all of those things. Maybe it's just that everybody is thinking along these exact same lines, where Davis was an undervalued prospect, a young prospect, a young NFL player now, who the Bills made a devastating mistake by not unleashing last year. And even though they made that mistake, they're a quality organization, they're going to rectify that. And, you know, once they do this year, it's hard to put any kind of lid on what his ceiling would be. And it's one of these elements where one of the reasons why I do pretty strongly believe that there are some fake things about his ADP that you have to be concerned about is that right now, young wide receivers in Dynasty are expensive, and they should be. And yet he is not. The disconnect between where he is in redraft and where he is in Dynasty makes absolutely no sense. And it gives you a red flag one direction or another, but basically it forces you to have him on all of your Dynasty startups because the price is ludicrous. And yet basically I just wish he were less expensive, because if he were less expensive, he'd be one of the most exciting plays of the year. Where he is, a lot of that is priced out. But you know me, Ben, I'm a dreamer. I'm an enthusiast. Even when it's priced out, I have a hard time stopping when I think the guy is going to blow up.
Yeah, that's exactly where I'm at. Like, he would be a smash a round or 2 rounds later. And whatever the reasons for him going as high as he is, I still want to be in on it a little bit. I want to be in on what is really just sort of routes uncertainty. If he's running a full set of routes in the Bills offense as good as he already was, frankly, last year before the playoff game, I'd be comfortable paying up in the 5th round. It's sort of a small miss, big hit type play where if he takes another step, it could be a big, big hit. But I don't think he can be much worse than 6th round value or 7th round value. It would be great to get him in those ranges where you feel like there's not even a small miss, like even in an outcome other than him not running the routes, but even an outcome where he's just playing and doesn't make any growth or anything, he's probably going to project as a 6th or 7th round player, and you just get that. And that would be great to just be able to have that. But I think
then in your auction, when he becomes more expensive than Michael Pittman and Mike Williams and Keenan Allen,
then you have to let him go. Yeah, that's it. The fact that he's already here. That's a great point. In an auction, he can then be starting at this price, and then people, because he's trendy, still bid him up from there. And like you said, he starts getting into the Michael Pittman range. You can't draft him, or you can't win him in the auction. But yeah, that was very interesting. That's where I'm at in redraft. That I think I don't want to be all in on him because of the price, but getting some exposure to the routes uncertainty, to the potential for him to just be a massive piece of this Buffalo passing game that we want exposure to anyway. It's expensive relative to what he's done so far, but I want some shots at it. You kind of just dismissed Jerry Judy in your great rant there, which we haven't really talked about him, but he kind of just got stiff-armed aside for the KJ Hamler love. Is it fair to say that you're pretty Sutton over Judy? I found myself pretty Sutton over Judy. The market has found themselves pretty Sutton over Judy. I don't think Judy is really a great fit for what Russ is as a quarterback. And I know you were in on Judy last year, higher than me on Judy last year. Where do you still see some positive for him, or are you not? If you're playing the Broncos, you're playing him Sutton, Pricey, and Hamler, or Alberto, or Dulcich, or somebody cheaper.
Yeah, and this is another kind of cool way, I think, to link it in with the auction topic, where with his ADP, he's sandwiched in between guys like Metcalf and Davis and Bateman and Juju Smith-Schuster. Amon-Ra, even less expensive than that. Someone that you probably need to get exposure to because Jameson Williams more of a end of the season type of play. And so, I mean, I've burned roster spots on Williams, but that is an issue where if you use up that spot, you can't churn it the way you probably need to. So my exposure is very low. And at the same time, in an auction format, this is where we start to take multiple guys in the same area. And I think really benefit from that. I think the Cortland Sutton enthusiasm too is someone where it is a situation where now Judy becomes interesting in the auction because maybe a guy who was trendy last year, and I think trendy for good reason, is not as trendy now. And I think that some of the decision making, and I don't know a lot about it, and I certainly don't want to, hammer somebody for things that I don't really know about. But in addition to a few of the things he's done on the field, there's maybe the concern that he doesn't have quite the upside that some of these players with elite football character might have to take the next step or overcome a down season, something to that effect. But when you think of the sort of trio of players at Alabama and Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith and Jerry Judy and how good those other two guys are, you look at Judy's air yards profile actually from his rookie season, and you think about how a new coaching staff and a new quarterback might try and deploy him this year. This actually, I think, is sort of a compelling bounce back. I mean, we've evolved to the point where we understand that it's year 2 that you really want to target, which makes the year 3 guys, as opposed to breakout candidates, more post-hype candidates. I think that part of it in an auction makes Judy kind of interesting because we do expect this team to score a lot of points. Those top 2 receivers are tough because I do think that the strength of Albert O and Dulcich to put a little pressure on, a little target pressure, and this offense is going to shake out in a way that is unpredictable. And that could be either good or bad for drafters, depending on prices that you're getting. And then obviously a little bit depending on how lucky you are with who you actually select. I think that Judy is tough in snake, but I think in auction, someone that you probably want to create some exposure to. Well, Ben, let me throw that one back on you. I feel like I've been allowed to do several diatribes here. I can't be unbiased about the Kansas City Chiefs. If you ask me about Juju, I'm going to say he's the 21-year-old Juju, right, with Patrick Mahomes. If you ask me about Marquez Valdes-Scantling, I'm going to be, he's supposedly been the best wide receiver in their offseason activities. This is a vertical receiver who will not get the same level of attention of Tyreek Hill, which means you're going to see 6 or 7 70-yard touchdown passes. If you ask me about Sky Moore, I'm going to say Pat was right about him the whole way. You should have been drafting him in round 6 from the beginning of the season. If you ask me about Mecole Hardman, I'm going to say that player should get handoffs. So where are you on Juju Smith-Schuster? How should we be playing this?
Well, so the reason I wanted your thoughts is I just did the Kansas City projection recently. So Travis Kelsey had some, full season, you could say, like, skill decline. Looks like it. His targets per run dropped off a little bit, but he had the stinger midseason. It affected him for multiple weeks. He came back in the playoffs. That's his regular season numbers. Came back in the playoffs, averaged 9 targets a game, 7.5 catches, had 299 yards in 3 games. So basically 100 yards a game, and scored 3 touchdowns. Was basically his old self and was sort of down the stretch. I'm pretty much saying, I know Kelsey's old and you might have the drop off, but because he played through injury, I'm not saying the drop off happened last year. Basically, when I look at my numbers and I see that it somewhat did, like his yards per out run for the regular season was its lowest in several years, and some of those things, and he's getting up there in age. I think that had more to do with the injury, and I think he proved that in the playoffs. So when I did my projections, okay, Kelsey, I'm projecting for his normal target share, better than 2021, what he had done really in 2018, 2019, those ranges. When Tyreek was on the field, which with Tyreek off the field, I think there's even room for him to beat that. So I'm pretty aggressive in my Kelsey projection. And then after that, I wound up pretty low on Juju because I did have MVS with a strong role. I had Sky Moore getting plenty of volume, and I had Mecole, who you mentioned maybe only should get handoffs, but is a guy that last year his ADOT fell and was still very involved in the offense, has always been someone involved in the offense. Of those 4 sort of top Kansas City receivers, is the only one that was on the team last year and knows the offense and has caught passes from Patrick Mahomes prior to this season. I don't think he's going to be a star, but I do think he's going to continue to have a role. He's always been sort of a rotational player. He's been effective after the target. He's not great at earning volume, but he's actually had pretty solid catch rates and yards per target and some of those things throughout his career, even though he makes like some boneheaded plays and does some things wrong. I don't think he's amazing, but I do think the fantasy community has had enough frustration with Mecole Hardman that they're probably misunderstanding what his role would be. Now, the counter to that would be, in the past, he basically had no competition to be the third pass game weapon. You had Byron Pringle and Demarcus Robinson after Travis Kelsey and Tyreek Hill, guys like that. Now we're looking at, he has more competition to be the 4th pass game weapon than he's ever had, right? To be the 3rd. You have Kelsey, and then you have Juju, MVS, and Sky, and I would put all of them in a class ahead of anything that the Chiefs have been able to put out there to compete with Mecole's role as sort of maybe this 3rd passing game weapon. So maybe it's just a fact of now that they have some depth that Mecole does get pushed aside. So there is some possibility there. But when I did my projection, I wound up having Mecole still getting this rotational role and still getting whatever 70 targets or something like that. Especially because of the use underneath. You're shaking your head. You're no way. You're saying he better not be getting that. But because of the use underneath that he got last year and some of those elements. So maybe it wasn't 70. I'm going to give you the exact number. I have him at, I had him at 70. All right, there you go.
How many targets do we have there for, and then specifically receptions do we have for Ronald Jones?
25 and 18 receptions, because I have CEH leading in targets, and I have McKinnon right in the same range as Jones. That's sort of the part-time third back that catches some passes as well. I have Jones as not catching a lot, but we did talk about how there's maybe a little bit of upside there with some screens and things if that happens. But yeah, 18 catches is not anything for anyone who's not familiar with the typical baselines and projections. I could have projected him for 10, but I am projecting him to lead their team in rush attempts over CEH. So that's a really low receiving mix with his rushing work. But anyway, I came out with this projection that was with the receivers and tight ends that was very heavy Kelsey, and then Juju next, certainly the only other 100-target player, MVS right below 100 targets, Sky, and Mecole Hardman still chipping in enough that the 4 receivers, the gap between them is narrower than most of my projections from wide receiver 1 down to wide receiver 4. And because of that, I think I'm going to wind up looking at Juju as sort of overpriced. And I don't know that I disagree with that, because he hasn't been great the last couple of years. I do think the upside still exists from his early career. I do think we might still, see that again in his career, but Sky could be good, right? And the Mecole stuff, if it's not Mecole, maybe it's MVS, but they're different, more vertical roles, but Mecole might be in the the shallower area. And then obviously Kelsey is dominating volume in the shallower area of the field, which is where Juju has done obviously the most of his damage. So the reason I was kicking it to you on Juju was that I found myself saying, I don't think I really want to draft Juju.
And I don't have as much as I thought I might recently, because we do get him now into this area, like I mentioned, where there are some guys squeezing each other there. And that's the great part about auctions, is that you can load up on that tier that you really like, but has a bunch of players that make it difficult to land them all on one team. In a snake draft, you don't want to start drafting the round 5 guys in round 3 and round 4 and giving up all of that ADP value. In the auction draft, you can set yourself up to do that. And you can set yourself up to do that without still overpaying if you get into this situation where there are some other drafters going after the same guys. Because as you mentioned, that range, Metcalf, Davis, Judy, Bateman, Smith-Schuster, you could even work in a Darnell Mooney, but Amon-Ra, Godwin, a player you mentioned, might be the fantasy playoff hammer. Elijah Moore. So it's not just having like one or two guys who are right next to each other in ADP, but having a variety of players that you can attack in that range. I like to approach it in that fashion.
But I think, so as you read those names, Amon-Ra and Elijah Moore go after Juju. I think specifically, continuing my attack on Juju, I think I would take both of them over him, which makes it tough then to get into scenarios because of how ADP is. I agree with you. In an auction, obviously you could get some exposure, but I might get both Amon-Ra and Elijah and be more happy with that. Wait, how would you rank those 3 players, just off the top of your head?
Well, I've had to continue moving Amon-Ra up because he does so many of the things that we look for. And I think that there's the potential that all of the USC guys were knocked a little bit in terms of how they looked as prospects because of how that offense played. And Ben, I mean, if you're going to be high on Jared Goff, you've got to be high on his number 1 wide receiver. But Bateman's someone I think could have a massive target share, which cancels out a lot of the concern about overall size of the pie. Elijah Moore, he was maybe my favorite rookie wide receiver last year, definitely favorite for the price. When I'm looking at Zach Wilson and Garrett Wilson and how all of that's going to play out, I just keep going for the cheaper player.
For Garrett Wilson. Yeah, I understood. That's where with the Jets, I talked about it obviously earlier in the show, that I think that gap between Elijah Moore and Garrett Wilson doesn't make a ton of sense. All right, well, I think we hit on basically everything. Another show where we went way longer than we kind of intended to. I do have one more very random player that I think I would target in an auction, and that is Javonte Williams. I'm not getting as much exposure to him as I want because he's going in a range with Kyle Pitts. He's going in a range where I'm starting to look at A.J. Brown and still some receivers, obviously. But if he was cheaper, we talked about, you mentioned Etienne, Breece Hall, J.K. Dobbins. He'll be probably a little bit more expensive than them. But if he was cheaper than a lot of the other running backs going in the first 2 rounds in an auction, I'd love to make him my top running back. I think that's a format where I wouldn't have to be out on Pitts to take Javonte, which in a snake draft, you kind of have to be, right? So unless you can get Pitts to come back to you in the 3rd. But Javonte's late 2nd price tag, because of structural things, has been difficult to get exposure to, but somebody that I want more exposure to, and I think in an auction fits what we were talking about.